So good evening, one and all. Welcome to a new, this was designed at some point, I think, as a spring series, but we seem to have sprung and we are now in the midst of starting a summer series. I don't know which day officially summer begins, but it feels like we may be, have reached that. So this is a summer series on electricity in Jewish life. I had initially called the series Halachic Electricity and was brought to my attention that's a somewhat ambiguous phrase, and it could just be about halacha being electrifying. So I thought it'd be a bit more clear. Electricity in Jewish life. I'm going to share my screen with you. You can let me know if you can see it. Okay. Can you see the screen? Yeah? Okay. So when we say electricity in halachic life, I assume for many of you, you have tuned in with the presumption that we will be talking about Shabbat in particular, about phones on Shabbat and televisions on Shabbat, or cars of the future on Shabbat, maybe space rockets on Shabbat, as that is the most pertinent question when it comes to electricity. For many of us, it's the way that we engage with it on a weekly basis. And the truth is, electricity on Shabbat is a central part of our discussion, but electricity revolutionized society in such a radical way that its impact is felt across the entire spectrum of human existence, and halakha is no different. It weaves its way into almost every realm of our ritual, spiritual, social, moral, theological lives. And halakha has a response to all of that. Just as some examples, we actually addressed this question a little before Pesach. Can I use an electric machine to make matzah? There's a question about when it comes to yortzeit. Can I use an electric candle to fulfill my obligation? There's a question of whether I can place a phone call to fulfill my obligation to visit the sick. Whether some of you may have seen today, the court case that has been in the news or has been awaiting in the news for the last week. The former policeman Chauvin went to court today, but of course he didn't go to court. There was a live stream, and the question turns to Bet Din. Can Bet Din convene a court case via live stream, or is there an obligation to have people physically in the room? That is a question about electronic capacity to replace human presence. And of course, using electric key cards to get in hotel rooms. In Israel, it comes up less often because they usually have a manual key precisely for Shabbat purposes. You go to a conference in America, not only are the doors electric only, sometimes the bathrooms. You go to the bathroom, you can't stand up for 24 hours because if you stand up, it's going to set off an electric flush. Of course, I'm not saying that bottom line at this point, but there are questions about halakha. And of course, most pertinently over the last 3 months, we've had the question of whether electricity can replace presence, not just in a courtroom, but in a synagogue. Can I generate presence of a minyan through these means? And of course, the bottom line when it came to minyan was we couldn't say Kaddish for the last few months over Zoom. So we're going to have to address all these questions, and it will fall to us to filter these into segments that are chronologically or conceptually neat, so we can feel like we're covering ground in an organized way, which we will do. But before we turn to, this is part one, as you can see, before we turn to the outline of our halachic project over the next few weeks, I want to begin with a little bit of the history of the discovery of electricity, and also then a little bit of the impact on the American legal landscape, so that nobody thinks halakha is this kind of antiquated system, and I would never think any of you think that, but in theory, one could come to the conclusion halakha is this rochady old system trying to come to terms with a modern world, and it's just not built to cope with these kind of changes. So I hope to not only show the discovery of electricity over time, but how radically new the questions we're facing are, but also show that every legal system has had to come to terms with changes that were beyond the imagination of our ancestors, and the American constitutional system is no different, and we'll come to a couple of those cases. But we begin with the ancient world. Now, I assume many of you don't recognize this fellow. That's because it's a painting and nobody knows who the mythic god Phaeton looked like. But I should note, even though we said electricity is radically new, the ancient world was quite aware of electric forces. Again, they didn't have sockets and plugs and laptops, but they understood very well that there is something electrifying in the world. What means may they have come in contact with electricity?
Lightning.
So lightning is fascinating because it's a given to us that lightning is a form of electricity. At the time, they certainly came in contact with light. Well, hopefully not too much contact. They certainly saw lightning. It's unclear whether they thought that lightning was an electric force or something else, apparition in the sky. But there was another way. They literally came in contact with electricity in the ancient world.
Static electricity.
Excellent. So static. Firstly, if you walk on certain materials, you build up a charge and you get a shock. Sometimes you can get physically spark, especially if it's very humid. It can spark a lot. Is that right? Or when it's not humid?
Not humid.
When it's not humid. When we were living in Chicago for the last 6 years, in the winter, there is such low humidity. We all had to get these humidifiers. I don't know if people have humidifiers here. We didn't get one this year. But the Sahara Desert had more humidity than our apartment in Chicago did. And my grandmother came to visit us, and she was just setting a light every time she touched a door handle. So yes, they certainly would have come in contact with static electricity in that sense, and not only from building up a charge or touching metal objects, but if they were fishermen, we tend not to come into contact very much with electric eels, but they were quite aware that there were some animals that generated a charge as well. In ancient Egypt, there are reports and records of that. But it is the static that is the key. And static, nowadays, we've got a lot of synthetic materials that build up a charge. In the ancient world, it wasn't that frequent that you had nylon carpets, even in Chicago. But there is an element in nature that appears to attract a static charge in particular. Anybody know which element this is?
Hydrogen.
So it is seen as a precious stone, and it features heavily in Jurassic Park. Anyone knows how they rebuilt the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park?
Amber.
Amber. Excellent. Amber is precisely the element, that stone that holds a static charge, and we'll come to in a moment. Actually, the word electricity is just an adaptation of the Latin word electron, which means amber. Amber comes, electricity, the word comes from amber. And here we have, just to provide you with the background, the Greeks had a myth of the son of Helios. Helios was the god of the sun, lowercase g, of course. And Phaeton was the son of Helios. And Helios had a number of children. Phaeton was hanging out with his friends, and like an ancient episode of Jerry Springer, some of his friends said, Helios isn't really your father, your mother had infidelity, and you shouldn't believe that he's your father. So he stormed the stage, everyone started cheering, fight, 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 as apparently it happens on Jerry Springer, I've never seen it. And Phaeton went up to his father Helios and said, how can I prove that you're my father? I need to know. And his father Helios said, I'll give you whatever you like, just ask. And Phaeton said, okay, let me ride the sun chariot, and that will prove that I have your genetic makeup, you are my father. And his father Helios in the myth said, I said I would give you anything, I really don't advise that. You are not going to be able to control that chariot, it's going to be terrible. He couldn't persuade his son, and Phaeton said, okay, I'll do it. Helios gave it to him, Phaeton took off on the horses. In the myth, he could not control the chariot veered away from the earth, and the earth froze because the sun was too far. It veered toward the earth and nearly scorched the entire population, at which point Zeus, the head god, said, this isn't working out. He took some thunder, he threw it at Phaeton, and the entire thing came crashing down. Phaeton died. And Phaeton had 7 sisters called the Haliads. Again, I'm not reporting history, but myth. And what happened to his sisters were they mourned his loss, these daughters of the sun, And their mourning was so extreme, so profound, that they turned into poplar trees. Anyone know what poplar trees are? That's them. They turned into poplar trees, and their tears from their mourning turned into, you guessed it, amber. So that is the Greek mythic way to come to terms with the special properties that amber had, how they came to terms with the fact that it seemed to attract this charge, release sparks of electricity, was that amber was the tears of goddesses who were the daughters of the sun. That's from Jurassic Park, as you can see the little dinosaur on the top with a mosquito trapped in. And here is the proof from the dictionary that electrum is amber, which is where we get the word electric from. Now, that was in the ancient world in Greece. Of course, over time, experiments developed. They had, as you say, contact with static electricity, and the scientifically minded among the medieval scholars thought, if I can rub this and it builds a charge, I'm going to experiment. Of course, they didn't have much use for static electricity. It was more of an annoyance until they realized that something can hold a charge and manipulate objects. And they came up on the extreme left here on your screen. You have what is called the experiment of the floating boy. They used to take young boys, build up a static charge in them, and suspend them so they weren't grounded. And then they'd have little sheets of paper and rods so that the boy, presumably who was paid to do this and not forced into this, would manipulate objects to entertain an audience. Of course, moving across, that still had very little functionality. It was just entertainment. In the middle of the screen, who's in the middle of your screen right now? Benjamin Franklin, who also scientifically minded, did a lot of experimentation. And there was the famous experiment where he took a string, tied it to a kite, and put a key on the end to see, precisely to experiment with the idea that was proposed, that lightning is a form of electricity. Now, what would have happened to him if he put that kite up and lightning struck it? Yeah, the American Revolution probably wouldn't have happened to start. He wouldn't have made, it wouldn't have been a very good result. So it turns out that there was, when he did that experiment, a lot of charge in the sky, but there was no lightning. So he survived, but he managed to assure that there would be a charge. And through that means there was still nothing really learned apart from one application. What was the invention of Benjamin Franklin relating to lightning and electricity? The Franklin rod, the lightning rod that you would often see on top of buildings in order to save buildings from being destroyed. And on the extreme right, you have here an image of Frankenstein, the fictional figure who was inspired by lightning itself to see if he could overcome death and regenerate life. Anyone know who wrote Frankenstein?
Shelley.
Mary Shelley, exactly. Mary Godwin Shelley. They actually came out with a movie in 2017 called Mary Shelley, which I happened to see on a plane. Often it's just rubbish they got on a plane, and I was streaming through, and it said it was a movie about Mary Shelley, the authoress, and I thought, oh, I'll have a look. And it was a fascinating movie as she struggled with a life of tragedy and loss. Her mother died when she was very young, and she was obsessed with galvanism. Anyone know what galvanism is or was? Galvanism was the practice through chemical experimentation of inducing a charge in dead organic objects. They would take frogs' legs and they would poke it and it would twitch. And she became obsessed with this idea that maybe reanimating life was possible. She wrote the history of how she wrote Frankenstein. She wrote it in the age of her young 20s. One of the most classic works of literature to arise out of the 1800s. She wrote in her young 20s as part of a contest. She was told that one boring night, stuck in the middle of fog with a couple of friends, there'd be a contest to write a ghost story, and she wrote Frankenstein, a remarkable achievement that was actually published not under her name, because no one would believe that a woman wrote it at the time, until her father, who was also an author, published it under her name later in life. By the way, the word galvanism is not an ancient word. It comes from the scholar Luigi Galvani, who invented the system of galvanism in the 1800s as part of his research into electricity. Now, after this study, there was still very little use. Again, we're now in the 1800s. There's still very little use for electricity. It's amusing. You can make buoys who are floating, manipulate pages. You can make sparks to entertain people. You can even stop lightning from ruining homes. But on the average experience of the average human being, electricity had very little role to play. Michael Faraday, you may have heard of him. He invented the field of electromagnetism and was responsible for the fact that we now have car engines and other systems that work, again, on the basis of batteries and electricity. But he also couldn't really, at the time, come up with any uses. And when he was asked about this, you have on your screen, dedicated to the higher calling of truth, Michael Faraday had little patience for utility. He was just a scholar who was experimenting. After he demonstrated a new chemical process or opened a new electromagnetic realm, and the inevitable question followed, what is its use? Faraday liked to quote Benjamin Franklin, who had famously replied, what is the use of an infant? Which is a good question. Infants aren't that useful. They can be very cute, but as they are not that useful. But an infant, of course, you nurture and you cultivate and you foster and you educate and you teach so that as they grow, they are incredibly useful. And he says the answer of the experimentalist is endeavor to make it useful, meaning I've shown you an experiment, so figure out a way to make it useful. Now, after Michael Faraday, some of you may be more familiar with this figure. There is a place in New Jersey named after him. Thomas Edison,
New Jersey.
Edison, New Jersey. This is Thomas Edison. Now, Thomas Edison was really at the forefront of making electricity incredibly useful. Without Edison, we would still be using electricity to entertain small crowds with floating children. What Edison did was find a way to generate voltage and current in a way that could ignite fields with light. And there actually was a movie, I don't know if any of you saw this, called The Current War, which describes the war that broke out between Thomas Edison and his opponent, George Westinghouse, who were both developing a current to actually ignite the Chicago World Fair in 1893. One developed the DC, which is not a universe of comic heroes, but the direct current. One invented the AC, the alternating current. And there's a lot of controversy behind the scenes, a lot of ego behind the scenes. In fact, Edison contributed to the first use of the electric chair in order to try and further his invention and to build his name, which happened in his lifetime. Westinghouse leaked that information to the press to try to discredit him. And that's all depicted in that movie. Either way, that leads us to the current day, where electricity has become not just a means of entertainment, not just something shocking when we enter rivers filled with eels, not something generated by a mythic idea about amber, but something that is integrated into everything that we do. We are all sitting right now surrounded by flurries of current. I'm sitting here on a machine that is ignited with light, both on the keyboard next to the camera, the screen is light, I've got my phone next to me, my watch is electric, the light's here, the AC that's on. We are surrounded by this stuff. 100, 200 years ago, it was unimaginable the extent to how far this would go, and this has perplexed legal systems over time. And we turn for a moment to the American legal landscape, and a case in 1927, when a young man called Ray Olmsted was a member of the police, and he also happened to be a bootlegger. Anyone know what a bootlegger was?
Sold illegal alcohol.
Excellent. Nothing to do with boots or legs, but he used to sell alcohol during Prohibition, and he was a police officer. I know police are a difficult subject at the moment, but he was a police officer in the 1920s during the era of Prohibition, and he was actually nicknamed the Good Bootlegger because he sold alcohol as a business. He didn't use it as a means to build gangs and to threaten people, but he sold it as a business. And because he sold it as a traditional business, the other police found a way to get him arrested, which was by wiretapping. This is the early 1900s, 1927. They wiretapped him and they got information. And on the basis of that wiretap, the judge issued a warrant to search his premises, at which point he assumed he'd be thrown into jail. until a friend lawyer of his said, hold on a minute, the way that the warrant was issued was illegally obtained. How did the judge decide to issue a warrant on the basis of the wiretap? The wiretap was an illegal search. That was the claim of the lawyer at the time, because it is illegal for policemen to walk into your house without a warrant and to rummage about. It is illegal for them to walk into your house and hide there behind a chair and listen to your conversations. So why would it not be illegal for them to tap your phone and virtually intrude? That was a suggestion of the lawyer. It made its way through the court system up to the Supreme Court, and a 5-4 decision said, Fourth Amendment right to privacy and to have warrants issued for searches only applies to physical means of detection, meaning physical presence. 5-4, it was ruled wiretapping is not an illegal search. There is no need for a warrant to wiretap. And at the time, one of our very own, Justice Brandeis, led the dissenting opinion, and he said as follows: in the application of a constitution, our contemplation cannot be only of what has been, but of what may be. Don't think this is going to stop with wiretapping, he's saying. The progress of science in furnishing the government with means of espionage is not likely to stop with wiretapping. Ways may someday be developed by which the government, without removing papers from secret drawers, can reproduce them in court, and by which it will be enabled to expose to the jury the most intimate occurrences of the home. You can call this a prescient if you like. He sees that someday people can just steal your emails and reproduce it in court. And he says, if we say wiretapping is good, you are making a huge mistake. And here the quote that follows, oh, I missed that. That right after the red lines. That places the liberty of every man in the hands of every petty officer. At which point he leads a dissent saying this can't be legal. Not much is done until the next case comes in 2000 on this subject, where there was a man living called Kylo. I can't remember his first name, but his name was Kylo. And he was growing a number of drugs in his home. I don't know which are the ones that you grow with the plants. Is that cannabis?
Yeah.
Okay, so you grow cannabis. He would grow cannabis. Say again? Yeah, so okay, he was growing cannabis in his home. One way you can detect cannabis growing in someone's home is if you have a thermal imaging gun, you will see a lot of heat around where they're growing because they're organic matter and they produce heat. And on the basis of thermal imaging and some tips from neighbors, police got a warrant to search his property and had him arrested. And again, he thought he was going to spend his life in jail. They caught his house full of cannabis until another lawyer came forward and said, hold on a minute, this is not really that different from wiretapping. That was an illegal virtual intrusion into your home. And this came before the United States Supreme Court in 2000-2001 term. And it was a 5-4 decision in the other direction this time. An unusual moment where Justice Scalia and the more liberal figures on the bench, RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, sided together with another 3 who said that this was an illegal intrusion. And they had such, and I read some of the argument here in the Supreme Court papers, and I will spare you of the nuance that they engage in and the petty detail, in which there are some views that say, well, you can take a photograph of someone's house without a warrant. Why can't I take a thermal image? And then they have a back and forth, as you see here in the 4th, 5th line. There are some thermal imaging guns that are called off the wall, where it just reads the outer temperature of the wall. And the argument was that should be no different to a photograph. And there are some thermal imaging guns that look through the wall, and that would be an intrusion. And back and forth. And Scalia basically says, if you think there's a difference between off the wall and in the wall, you're insane. This is not just a photograph. It provides information that the naked eye can't. And they ruled against the allowance of thermal imaging without a warrant. So if anybody comes to arrest you based on a thermal image, you can ask them for a warrant before they carry you away. Now, there is one more sphere in American law that we'll look at this right now, which came up only a few weeks ago, which applies to a couple of people in our community and beyond, which is it used to be legally, you could only get married in New York City if you made an appointment with a city clerk and you went there physically. And it felt like a burden. I remember when we got married all those years ago, we had to go to the city clerk in Passaic, New Jersey, and they actually, you made an appointment and they wrote it in a black book with a pen, not online. So if you made an appointment on the phone, there was no real guarantee that it would be there when you got there. It was a messy system and it felt like a hindrance. And for some reason, it took this virus to let the governor decide that now you can get marriage licenses virtually, which of course begs the question, why couldn't we do it virtually beforehand? And presumably there was a value there to insisting that the public have a physical interaction with the city clerk. One could be cynical, I guess, and argue that it was to ensure that they could hire more people for the process. I guess in theory, it could be for identification purposes. It could be because there was a feeling, a relic, that they thought that there should have a formality to the bond being forged here, and you need to do that in the physical presence of others. But what we've seen is the invention or discovery of electricity and its use was so sudden, so rapid, and so radical that it flummoxed the American legal system, and it is still being resolved today, whether legally you can get married online or not, which leads us to our halachic subject. We're not going to cover a huge amount of halachic detail today, but essentially our course of study over the next couple of weeks is going to be arranged in three pieces, which is electricity in Jewish life. Number one, agency. If I do something with electricity, is it as if I did it myself? That's question number one. Where is there an application for that? We'll see in a minute. There are a number of applications in halachic and legal life as to if I press a button, is it like I did it or not? So that's number one. Number two, which is the question that's hovering over many of our minds, I imagine, is it creative labor? If I press a button, is it one of the 39 prohibited labors on Shabbos? And if it is, which one is it? Because if we count out all 39, I won't ask you to do that, there is dyeing of colors, there is planting of seeds, there is cooking, and we could do shchita, slaughtering. There's a whole bunch. There ain't electricity or pressing buttons anywhere. So we're going to have to figure out how electricity on Shabbos becomes a problem. And the third realm, which I would have found very unintuitive until this crisis to speak about, is can electricity simulate or substitute for things? Can it substitute for connectivity, as we've said? Can I use it to build a minyan? There is a bracha that we say in Nisan every year. You see a tree that blossoms, you say a special bracha once a year. What if I see it online? Do I say a bracha? That would be a question. And flames, we said with Yortzeit candle, but there'd be a question about Shabbos candles with electric lights, Havdalah candles with electric lights, and other such cases as well. There is a rule that Bet Din, the Jewish court, can only convene in daylight. So can electric lights emit more light than the sun in terms of how it illuminates the room compensate? We're going to come to all those matters. But today, we turn on the question of agency. For those who've seen Avatar, I think I mentioned to you in the past, I saw it 3 times in the movie theater, twice of which was in the front row. It was the first 3-dimensional movie. Sitting in the front row for that is not advised. It left me nauseous until the 3rd time. But the premise of Avatar is you're sitting in a chamber somewhere, and through wires, there is a being out there in the world that you are moving through your impulses, through your mental decisions, through your muscular system, through your nervous system. It is an avatar of you. And the question would be, if that avatar did something on your behalf, is it as if you did it? Now, there are 3 central rabbinic texts to this question, which we will use to address. Number 1 is a Gemara in Chulin. And this begins with the Mishnah in the context of ritual slaughter. Anyone here ever done shchita? Okay, good. Anyone here ever seen shchita? Okay, even better. I presume that's why we don't have that many vegetarians on. I managed to conveniently miss that trip to the abattoir during my smicha training. I don't cope with gushing blood very well. So here's the discussion. Nafla sakin v'shachta. If you were in a farm And there were cows everywhere. You were on an upper level of a farm barnyard building, and you dropped a knife, and it happened to fall and shech the cow in exactly the way that it would have been kosher had you have stood there and did it yourself. Is it kosher or not? The Mishnah says, even though the ritual slaughter was precisely how it needed to be, Sula, it doesn't count, because the verse says, you need to shecht it and eat it, meaning it requires human agency for shechita to work. So, Masha tazovecha ta'ochel, that's the explanation of the verse, that you have to kill it in order to eat it. Now, the Gemara says, Tama de nafla, the only reason that that's possible is because it fell. Ha hipila, what if you threw it? What if you caused it to fall? Kshera, it's kosher. You take a knife, you're an expert knife thrower, as I'm sure some of you have seen on America's Got Talent or elsewhere. There are people who do this for a living. You took a knife, you stood a cow on a plinth, and you threw the knife, and it shechted the cow precisely as it's meant to. Our instinct may have been, that doesn't count, you need to be holding the knife. For human agency to work, it has to be in your hands. And this is the first step that suggests that human agency does not need to be hand-to-hand contact. If you generated the energy, if you generated the momentum, it's as if you did it. So that's case number one. Case number two, which will explain why you have the image of a watermill on your screen. This is the Gemara in Chulin. And the Gemara in Chulin says, Amar Mar. Mar says, Hashochet b'muchni. If one does shchita with a mechanism, a machine, meaning that watermill that's rotating there, if you tied a knife to the end of it, and you lifted up the water channel to turn the mill on, and then the knife went round and it killed an animal, would that work? Shchita tok sheira. The Gemara says, yes, that is a kosher way to kill an animal. So now we have a second step, where not only are you not touching it, but you didn't quite generate the momentum with your own energy, with your own muscle. You lifted up a lever, water came rushing through, got the mill going, and the knife moved. And yet the Gemara seems to indicate that's you. That's your agency. Now, again, shchita is one realm where this is important. Another realm this could be legally important is if you decided you were a sadistic, horrific murderer, and you set up this way and you decided to kill someone that way. Would you be found culpable in Jewish law for the results of this? Or are we saying this is not agency? So number one, you throw it, that's agency. Number two, you lift up a funnel and water charges through, that's you. But the Gemara questions that for Hatanya, and it questions it from a pretty strong brighter that just said, Shchitato psula. No, it doesn't work. So either a mill does work or a mill doesn't work. Lo kasha, the Gemara says, don't worry. An easy way to resolve it, ha basarna de pachra, ha basarna de maya. One is talking about a potter's wheel. How does a potter's wheel work? Anybody know? Anyone see a ghost? How does a potter's wheel work? So at least in the old days, now you probably press a button. In the old days, there was a foot pedal that you pushed to make the wheel move on top while you were shaping pottery. So if you set it up on a mill where you were using your foot to push, which still is not the same as throwing it, because when you throw it again, you're generating the momentum through the mechanics of your muscles. In a potter's wheel, you're generating momentum through pushing a lever, which pushes another cog, which pushes a wheel, which spins this, and then moves the knife. So there is another remove there, but there seems to be a concession. Everyone would agree that's your agency, but with a watermill, maybe not. However, Ibayat Ema, Ha basarna demaya. Now maybe we could say there is a watermill that you just lift up a door, water comes gushing out and functions with the machine, and you can already see why maybe this might apply to the case of electricity. You lift up a switch, something begins to flow. So here you lift up a door, water charges out, turns on a wheel, and we say maybe you can still do shchita that way. Ha b'koach rishon, ha b'koach sheni. And the answer is, when would that work? Only b'koach rishon. Now, what on earth is koach rishon? Essentially means the first instant. You lift up the gate, there was an assumption that you are responsible for that initial charge of water. But after that first flow of water is finished, the remaining of the flow doesn't work. So only one shechita would work with a knife, and if it kept going, that wouldn't work anymore. Now, the Gemara says, hold on a minute, talking of horrific ways to kill people. Rav Papa said, Hi, man, The kafte lechavre. What about this guy who tied up his friend? And I assume friend is being used here loosely. Someone who tied up their acquaintance, let's say, and then he unleashed a flow of water. He lifted up a dam, and it then drowned his friend, and he died. Chayev, we said you're chayev. So hold on a minute. You lift up the thing, water comes charging out, and it kills your friend. It sounds like water mills, water flows, lifting up a gate, starting the flow of water is your agency. My tama, gire didei huda ahani be, because it's as if he set the water free. Vahani mili bekoach rishon, and the answer is that's just the first flow. So it turns out, if you are in the ancient world and you wanted to murder someone, you had to put them far enough away from the dam that when you lifted it up, it wouldn't be the initial burst of water that killed them. If you put them right next to a dam, you lifted it up, water hit them, that's you. Now, what have we established from these two sources? Number one, if you throw something, even if you're no longer holding it, it is you. Number two, if you release a flow, the first thrust is you. You pick up a door, water charges out, and then it sets off a mill in motion. That's you. You lift up a dam, water flows out and kills someone with the first thrust of water. That is you. If you lift it up and 3 days later, the mill is still going, that's not you anymore. Okay. So those are the first two sources. And now we have the final one. This is a Gemara in Sanhedrin. Zarak chetz. You shot an arrow. Vitaris biyado, and you shot it at, let's say, William Tell. He's standing there with the shield, no problem. Va'acher v'natlo. Someone comes along and takes the shield away. The arrow's midair. They take the shield away. What is your instinct? Is he guilty for the guy's death?
No.
Why not?
Because when he threw it, he thought he wasn't going to die from that.
Okay, what about the person who moved the shield? Va'afilu hu kadam, look at the continuation. Zarak chetz v'taris biyado. You shot an arrow. The person you shot it at is holding a shield. Va'acher v'natlo, someone took away the shield. Afilu hu kadam v'natlo pada. Even if the guy who shot the arrow finds a way to take the shield off the guy's hand. You shot an arrow up in the sky. You know it's going to land next to you where your friend is holding his shield. You pinch his shield away, and the arrow falls and kills him. Pater, you are not guilty. The be'idna de shadi be, because at the moment when you shot the arrow, mifsik sikegere, the arrow was already in the air, and it would have stopped. When you shot the arrow, the shield was there, it wouldn't have hit. So this is the third case, and these are progressive texts of distance and agency. So the first case is you throw something, it's still you. So even though intuitively there's a gap, you would have thought maybe it's not me, you throw it, it's still you. Second case we had was if you unleash a stream of water, the first thrust of water is you. And the last case is if you move a shield and something that was already moving hits someone, that is not you. So now the question is going to become, which one is the most like electricity? When you do electricity, if you hit a switch, are you essentially throwing a knife? Are you throwing the current? Are you simply removing a door in front of a stream of water that's built up against that door? Or is it like moving a shield away when you've got a flow that's already going and really you're quite passive? That's the question that the modern commentators and legalists had to address. And here you have on your screen a scene from The Matrix. I think it's the third movie where they dress in these avatar bodysuits that do shooting on their part. And here we have the Har Tzvi and Achiezer, who take two radically different views about what is electricity. The first view, the Har Tzvi, says essentially, we won't read it all inside, he says, when you flip a switch, all you're doing is taking the shield out of the way of the arrow. The arrow's already there. The flow has got nothing to do with you. His suggestion, again, writing in the 20th century, is the flow of electrons is happening all the time. And when you lift up the switch or you connect to the circuit, you're basically just moving an arrow out the way and letting it flow. That's his view, which means what? Is electricity me or not me?
Not me.
Absolutely. It is not me. In the view of the hard Tzvi, if I press a button and somebody dies, that is inadmissible in court. Again, there are ways to deal in halachic literature with criminals of that sort, but halachically speaking, if I press a button, it's not me. If I press a button and I need to do it myself, it doesn't work. I don't fulfill a requirement, and I'm not culpable for the results. In the Achiezer, he says, no, this is actually nothing to do with the case of the arrow. This is far more aligned with the case of the water, where you lift up a blockage and the water flows, the current. Now, for those electricians and scientists out there, the current is not flowing all the time. Electrons don't build up by the side of the circuit where it ends, waiting for the circuit to finish. They sit static. You flip a switch and then the current begins to flow. So it's hard to really align any of these cases as a direct analogy. But the Achiezer, who was a formidable halachic figure in the 20th century, says it's like the water mill, where if you lift it up, what did we say? Is the water moving things you or not you?
Here we go. Yeah, there it is. Okay.
You.
We says you lift it up, it's
It
you.
is you.
So he's now suggesting that electricity is human agency. You press a button, that's you. These figures in the matrix that were shooting those triggers and it released guns elsewhere, that is you. That is his argument. And again, now we have 2 minutes, 3 minutes left, and we'll very, very quickly run through some cases where this comes up. And next week, we'll turn to the question of electricity on Shabbos. Now, the first case we'll come to is, we mentioned before Pesach, making matzah with a machine. Can you do it or not? This was a massive controversy at the time. We mentioned this again in that shir. There was a view that said, you need to do it with your own hands. And the pushback, which is in this box here, said, there is zero obligation in halachic literature to make matzah with your hands. There is an obligation for matzah to be made with the right intention, what's called lishma, with the intention that it's a matzah with a mitzvah. But no one says you have to do it with what's called koach gavra, with human agency. If somebody else, there's a debate in halachic literature, if a child makes matzah and you sit there and watch and you have in mind it should be for the right purposes, does it count? And the answer is essentially yes. And the dissenting view that says it can't is only because the intention of the child gets in the way of you witnessing intention. Now, machines don't have intentions, so it can't get in the way. So literally, we suggest electricity is your agency according to the Achiezer, but in this case, everybody would agree matzahs work because you don't actually need human agency. The next case this comes up is in tzitzit. Again, with the invention of machines and ways to weave without employing hundreds of people who were hurting themselves, you have machines made. Can you make tzitzit with a machine? We've got the Mincha Yitzchak and the Chesed Lavram, which both suggest, yes, there is no need for Koach Gavra. There is a debate here about whether you can impart Lishma to the process of Tzitzit, similarly to Matzah, but there's no need for Koach Gavra. So Matzah and Tzitzit are in the same bucket in the sense that there's no need for human agency, so the question is moot. We turn, however, here you have a mechanical factory for tefillin making. You may notice the tefillin that men wear today or buy today are incredibly square. And that is because most of them are made by machine that are very good at making squares. If you looked at tefillin from the early 20th century, 19th century, whether it's in museums, we may actually have some in the shul on display in the Holocaust area. I think there's a pair of tefillin there. A lot of the older tefillin were not that square, because they were made by hand. And the question came, can we use electricity? And the problem is with the Rambam, he says, Ein osin ha-tefillin ele Yisrael. A Jew has to make tefillin because the process of forging tefillin is important. Not just lishma, but there has to be agency. Why? Sha'asiyatan kichtivatan. Because the making of tefillin is like the writing of tefillin. Why is it like the writing of tefillin? Mipnei hashin, because there's a shin on the box. Now, there's not a shin on both boxes. There's an arm box and a head box. Which one has a shin on the actual box? Excellent. Well done, Grace. I won't ask you how you know that. It is the head tefillin. You have the arm one is covered with a box, usually to stop it from getting bashed around from sleeves or other things. But the box that's worn on the head has a shin on both sides, one of which has 3 arms and one of which has 4. Again, that's a discussion for another time. But the presence of text on the box means that it requires human agency to some extent, and there is a debate between the Mishnah Berurah and other authorities about whether machines can be used. And essentially, it fell down to the point that we rely on machines because they do a much better job. But really, if you know someone who can do an excellent handmade tefillin job, that's probably the best way to do it. But most people don't do that anymore. Now, so what we've seen is matzah and tzitzit, they don't need agency. Tefillin needs agency to some degree, and we were on the fence. And it needed agency to some degree because of text. What other ritual object in Jewish life has text on it?
Sefer Torah.
Sefer Torah, mezuzah, tefillin, cloth, absolutely. And the question then becomes, what about a printing press? Can I just print Sifrei Kodesh? Now, what sacred text do we read ordinarily, even when we're in shul, even when we have a minyan, even all things being ordinary, do we read from a printed book, a sacred text every week? What do we read?
Torah. Haftorah.
Excellent. Haftorah. We take out a Torah scroll to read the Torah, and then we get to the Haftorah, and we're just reading it out of an art scroll or whichever, or the Koran. Other books are available in all good bookstores. Whichever one, we're reading from a printed thing. So is it okay? And we don't have a lot of time, so I'll run through. There was a debate in the Magen Avraham Halachist and the Levusha Halachist, and the Tav Sofer ruled on this issue, suggesting that back and forth in the medieval period, people couldn't afford to write out the entire prophets with a scribe. So there was a ruling that you could have just a little bit. And sometimes you see this in shuls. I don't think we have any copies in the shul here. In Chicago, they had a cloth for Yeshayahu and a cloth for Yirmiyahu and a cloth for Treyasar. And there was somebody who used to lay in the Haftorah from a cloth, from a single book written on a cloth. Halachically, that's a problem. You need to write the whole of prophets rather than just a section. In the medieval period, they said you can just have a section because it's too expensive. And then there was a conclusion in the Magen Avraham, well, now we can print. You should just print the whole of Nevi'im and you don't need to have these little cloths, which makes it sound like he's saying printing is okay. You can use an electric printer, it sounds like, to generate sacred text. However, the Chashmal, Bahalacha, that deals with a number of these questions, Chashmal or Halacha says that was only in their time when the printing press involved somebody physically taking letters, sticking them into a imprinted page that would then be pressed down, which took on the form of writing. But he says to use an electric printer that we have, a brother printer, a Samsung printer, a printing press like the newspapers use, is so far removed, there's zero human agency. Now, I understand that with a printing press, but there was, in the final moment, I'll just share with you, there was a museum in Germany that had the following on display. They had a Sefer Torah being written on rotation by a mechanical arm that had been programmed and trained. As you see there, the script is perfect. Well, you may not be able to see that. Trust me, the script looks absolutely perfect. In some ways, it's probably more accurate than a human hand would be. So what happens if I get the proper quill and the proper ink and I put it in the hand and it's written with all the tugging and all the crowns and all the gaps and all the borders and everything that you need in a Sefer Torah? It's not a printing press. It has distinct written compartments. I press a button and it goes and writes a Sefer Torah. It would write it in a fraction of the time at the fraction of a cost. I'm not sure how many of you know how much a Sefer Torah costs. They are not cheap objects, primarily because it takes a year or so for somebody to write. If I could press a button and generate a Sefer Torah in a couple hours, I think I'd make quite a lot of money off that. So is it kosher? And it turns out Rabbi Soloveitchik in the following source addresses this not because he saw that in that museum in Germany, but from an abstract perspective. He addressed the question of why text, in particular, matzah and tzitzit, don't need human agency, they just need supervision. Tefillin needs a little bit of agency because it's got a letter on one of the boxes, and of course the Sefer Torah and sacred text, which are entirely made of letters. Rabbi Soloveitchik says, need human agency. Electricity will always fail. You can make this machine and imagine you will be a millionaire overnight because every community is going to turn to you for a $5,000 Sefer Torah instead of a 60,000 Sefer Torah. And Rabbi Soloveitchik says that would be lovely, but that doesn't work. Because of all the ritual objects that require agency, sacred text is the most central. And here in the bottom 4 lines here, Kasha Adam Yotzek, when a person imparts Latoch Tav Yado into the writing of their hand, and Kol Masha Atzo Benishmato, all that is bound up in their soul, Mamalehu et Otiot Hakarot Vashcharot, they fill up the dark and the light letters, Haktuvot al Klaf, made written on dead skin, Big Tusha, with sanctity. Az hofechet hadayo le'esh hashchara. That's when the ink transforms into black fire on white fire. Hagvilin v'hatiyot, the borders and the letters, ma'alin, they come to life. Through the mechanisms of the individual soul, mitchamamim, they are warmed through the human soul. V'na'asim kadoshim, and that's how they become sacred. And in his understanding that electricity can never replace human agency when it comes to writing a text, and he goes as far, we won't read it inside, to say that even the name of God inscribed by an electric pen fails to carry Kedusha as if it were written with a human hand. We as human beings are empowered to bring Kedusha into the world, and text, of course, is the central presence of Kedusha in Jewish ritual life. Now, let's summarize what we've covered today, and then we'll speak about what will be transitional next week. Today, we covered the history of electricity and its discovery and its utility. We turned on its influence in the American legal landscape, how it flummoxed wiretapping laws and thermal imaging laws and marriage laws. And then we looked at the 3 segments we'll be addressing in halachic life. Number 1 was agency. And we answered that question. Essentially, there was a divergence of views. 2 modern scholars, the Achiezer on the one hand and the Hartzvi on the other. One says electricity has nothing to do with you. It's like taking a shield out the way of a moving arrow for which you have no culpability or association. That was one view. The other view was the Achiezer, who says, no, it's like a stream of water. You open the door, you let it go, that's you. Now, we said that that's important in a couple of places where agency is required. Tzitzit and matzah, no agency is required, doesn't matter. Tefillin, agency is required to a level, so actually it is important whether electricity is you or not. And finally, Sefer Torah requires human agency, so it's centrally important whether it's you or not, and it seems to be that we fall in line with the Achiezer in some ways, and we fall in line with the Hartzvi and others. When it comes to writing a Sefer Torah, we say electricity isn't you. You can't do it through the means of a mechanical arm. However, I think we could be comfortable to suggest that if I pressed a button and it killed someone, I would be held liable in court for that. And the reason I know that is because next week, when we turn to the questions of electricity on Shabbos, we're going to begin with the question of, well, hold on a minute. What happens if I use electricity to do a malacha? What happens if I use electricity to shecht an animal? What happens if I use electricity to sow seeds or to cook? And whatever we think of electricity, those acts are prohibited on a biblical level, and we're going to presume that that is problematic for everyone. An electric lawnmower is problematic for everybody on Shabbos. Why? Because I'm cutting grass. I can't do that with my hands. I can't do that with electricity. And that's on the basis that we presume electricity is at some level you. So next week, we're going to come to the question of electricity on Shabbos. It is a complex whirlwind of a discussion. It is fascinating how it shifts over time. We are going to invoke the names of people like the Chazon Ish. Centrally, for this context, is a scholar who passed away 3 weeks ago, maybe more at this point, Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich, who is a bold, lone voice in the realm of electricity on Shabbos, and we're going to see the massive pushback that he was given and see where we fall today. We're going to talk about Kindles, we're going to talk about iPads, we're going to talk about smart homes, we're going to talk about Israeli electricity stations where people are working to provide electricity on Shabbos. So can I use my lights on Shabbos passively if a Jew is producing the electricity? We're going to talk about all those questions. We may not fit it all in next week, but we'll talk about it next week and we'll see how far we get. In the meantime, I'm going to stop sharing my screen with you. I am happy to take questions at this point. And for those who would like to do Mariv, we will stay on for Mariv. And I will Oh, there's something in the chat about an article about Rav Rabinovich on the Lehrhaus. You should all feel free to look at it. He's a fascinating figure. He lived in London for a number of years, heading Jews College. He was originally from Canada. So Canada produced some wonderful things in history, including Rav Rabinovich. He was recently Rosh Yeshiva in Modi'in. That's not correct.
No,
Thank you. Ma'ale Adumim. I knew it began with a ma and ended with an im. So next week, I'm happy to take any questions, and then we'll turn tomorrow.